Good evening, traveler. You've found a quiet corner of the internet where history moves slowly, voices speak softly, and curiosity is allowed to drift into sleep. Tonight's tale is The Great Fear of Vatican, the 13th Hour Beneath Street, Peter's Dome Stories for Sleep. I'll guide you at an unhurried pace through corridors and courtyards most visitors never notice. The bronze doors settling after midnight, the marble that remembers every footstep, the Swiss guard changing watches, the librarian's keys turning in old locks. Blended into this gentle journey are clear, grounded details. How St. Peter's Basilica rose from a 4th century shrine to a Renaissance colossus. Why the Great Dome bears hidden markings used by architects and astronomers. How bells were tuned and timed, and what the archives actually hold. Our mystery is simple and strange. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, a 13th hour opens beneath the dome, a misfit sliver of time that archivists note but cannot explain. A whispering gap where a forgotten clock, an older calendar, and an astrolabes shadow align. Across 6 long chapters, we will meet a cautious choirboy who hears hymns played backward by air alone, a restorer who finds an extra numeral on a clock face that shouldn't exist, and a visiting scholar who recognizes an echo of the pre-Gregorian sky. We'll follow maps etched into balustrades, count the steps to sealed stairwells, and trace the thin thread connecting papal timekeeping, ancient Roman star lore, and a vanished bellmaker's ledger never rushing, always pausing to explain what is real, what is recorded, and what is only rumor. If your eyes grow heavy as we wander, let them. This story is meant to settle you, and if you enjoy slow mysteries, careful facts, and the soft hush of old stone, please subscribe to this channel, so the next time the 13th hour opens, you won't miss the moment it begins. Sleep is welcome here. Curiosity may arrive. Drowsiness will follow. If you've ever tried to fall asleep by counting sheep and accidentally invented a tax system for them, you already understand the Vatican after midnight. Everything is calm, orderly, and faintly absurd. Bronze doors settle in their frames like old gentlemen in armchairs. Marble floors give back a soft echo that insists on being the last word in any conversation. And under street, Peter's Dome large enough to make your inner child say, "Wow," and your inner engineer say, "How insured is this?" The air holds that museum-quiet promise that nothing dangerous happens in well-labeled buildings. Our guide tonight is a junior archivist named Lucia, who dislikes odd numbers, untidy card catalogs, and she will tell you this twice the way pigeons pretend to be angels if you look up too quickly in the colonnade. At 12:03 a.m., Lucia unlocks a door that doesn't exist on the tourist map and leads us into the basilica's slow heartbeat. Stairs that circle inside. Thick masonry. Old iron grates that cough when opened. And a faint draft that smells like dust, candle wax, and the kind of secrets that make accountants nervy. Before we climb, some context. St. Peter's Basilica sits on the site of a 4th century shrine. The Renaissance rebuilt it into the largest church in the world. The famous dome, begun by Michelangelo and completed after his death, is not just a pretty hat. It is a load-bearing argument with gravity, solved through ribs, stone spines that carry weight, coffers, sunken ceiling panels that remove useless stone, and an elegant lantern on top, a small tower that lets light in and hot air out. The dome's exhaust fan with better manners. When you hear me say oculus, that means a round opening that lets in daylight as if the building had one perfect eye. When you hear apse, that's the semicircular end of the church where the altar lives, and where architecture usually stops pretending it's not a theater. Mind the step, Lucia whispers. because the step does not mind you. Her flashlight finds a brass disc press-fit into the marble landing. A little sun with 12 rays. You would think 12 is a good number for anyone who hates oddities, but this disc is exactly why Lucia is awake. There should be 12 hours in a night, she says, which is historically adorable. Medieval Christians lived by canonical hours, fixed times of prayer, with names like matins, late night, lauds, dawn, prime, early morning, then terce, sext, none during the day, and vespers and compline toward evening. Monks divided the day not into equal minutes, but into prayer events, like a calendar that thinks in hymns. Sundials, water clocks, and later bell clocks kept the rhythm in a way that felt holy, imprecise, and, crucially, non-negotiable. But the basilica's modern clocks, perched like patient eyes on the facade, insist on precision. Their job is to bully time into minutes, 60 equal ones, and seconds, 60 smaller ones, designed to make you late with dignity. The Vatican is very good at this. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII corrected the slow drift of the Julian calendar. That older system was losing about 11 minutes per year, and after a millennium or so, your spring festivals turn up in summer wearing the wrong shoes. The fix gave us the Gregorian calendar you use today. Leap years every 4 years, except century years like 1,700 or 1,800. Unless they are divisible by 4, 00, like 1,600 or 2,000, which is the kind of rule a mathematician finds elegant, and most of us find like a row of wet socks. The point is, the Vatican likes time to behave. Which brings us back to the brass disc and to the problem. At some unknown date, unknown, here meaning Lucia refuses to tell us until chapter 3, a restorer noticed that when the basilica is empty and the night is quiet, a thin blade of light slides across this disc, not once between midnight and 1, but twice. The first glow behaves. The second arrives, like a ghost, 10 breathing lengths later, and nobody can agree whether it is optical trickery, structural echo, or something more interesting, like time choosing to stub its toe on sacred stone. This extra visit of light is what Lucia calls the 13th hour, not a new number on the clock, more like a shy encore. We begin to climb in a corkscrew, cut between the inner and outer shells of the dome. Yes, there are 2. Michelangelo's dome is a double shell, which is to say a thick hollow egg designed by someone who didn't trust gravity, and was correct. The walls lean, because the dome curves. The stair becomes a polite argument with geometry. On the way up, Lucia pauses beside a narrow window. From here you can see, if you press your cheek to clean Roman air, the vast colonnade encircling street, Peter's Square, designed by Bernini to embrace the faithful in stone arms. If you whisper ellipses, the piazza hears you. The square isn't a square at all, but 2 overlapping ovals with focal points marked on the pavement. Stand on one. The 4 rows of columns line up as one. An optical trick that made pilgrims clap 2 centuries before Instagram filters. Optics, Lucia says, with the sigh of a woman who has spent too much time reading Latin footnotes, rarely leave room for miracles. But they do make miracles punctual. Very personal rover, and 1 pit of the face. She nudges open a service door into a small chamber tucked in the drum of the dome. On a table, a hand-drawn meridian line, a straight strip of inlaid brass used in old churches to measure the sun's noon ray, and a squat astrolabe, which is essentially a medieval smartphone for the sky. An astrolabe is a disc, engraved with a map of the stars and a rotating plate. Line up the parts, and you can tell time by the heavens. Find the altitude of a star, or pretend to be a sea captain without the sea. Very useful in Rome. Lucia's astrolabe is a replica, but the face is scratched in that reassuring way that says people have been wrong here many times before. Technical note, she says, and you can tell she enjoys saying it. A meridian is an imaginary north-south line. If you poke a tiny hole in the church wall high up called a gnomon, a sunbeam will crawl across the floor, precisely at noon, and kiss the meridian line. That's how they used to set clocks. No electricity, just astronomy and patience. And ladders. Is there a gnomon here? You ask, because even in a sleep story, we are all nosy. Officially, no, she replies. Unofficially, there are always holes in old buildings. Some were deliberate, some were mice with ambition. What does this have to do with an extra sliver of light around midnight? Quite a bit, if you happen to own the moon. We don't, of course, but the basilica's stones, ribs, and small accidental apertures could admit stray light, moon, city, even reflected glow from the lantern above that takes a complicated path. In physics, this is called multipath propagation, where a signal radio, light, your neighbor's Wi-Fi, takes several routes to reach you and arrives slightly out of sync. In a church, we call it, why is that beam of light behaving like a tourist who lost his group? Lucia prefers a more elegant phrasing. The building is listening to the sky with both ears. Humor aside, she is a historian, which means she treats every rumor the way a cat treats every closed box. Potentially important. She produces a ledger from the table. A photo of a ledger. Really, because the Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Secret Archive, where secret meant private, not spy novels, is not fond of letting original ink travel. The page is from a bell maker in the 17th century. It lists the tuning of bronze bells, weights, inscriptions, and a tiny marginal note. The night of the double ring. No date, no location, just the kind of scribble that ruins sleep and earns historians their coffee. Bells, Lucia says, are clocks that you can hear. A bell's pitch depends on its profile, shape, and alloy composition, mostly copper and tin. When you cast a great bell and tune it, you adjust not only the main note but the partial secondary tones that give the bell its character. If two bells are tuned to nearly the same pitch and are struck in close succession, you can hear beats, a pulsing sound as the waves interfere. Now, imagine a bell up there. She points toward darkness and saints, ringing once, then a ghostly repeat a breath later, as if the air decided to cast the clapper twice. So the 13th hour is acoustics? You offer, trying not to sound disappointed for the sake of mystery and ad revenue. It could be, she allows. Or optics, or both, or a quirk of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts the sky's coordinates over centuries, altering the relationship between architectural sightlines and celestial positions. The Renaissance loved to fold astronomy into architecture. Set a line in marble, and a century later, the sky returns at a slightly different angle. A patient building can keep appointments with stars the original masons never met. This is your first gentle lesson in how the Vatican does mystery, with paperwork, instruments, and enough humility to let wonder live in the margins. We climb again. The stair narrows to a tilted corridor inside the curving shell, the famous spot where tourists later lean like they're inside a soft-focus photograph of dizziness. At a half-height door, Lucia kneels and pushes it open into a cramped interstitial passage, a fancy way of saying, space the architects hoped no one would ever see. There's a hairline slit at the base of the outer shell, which once allowed builders to check for moisture. Tonight, the slit admits a pale scrawl of moonlight that slides over the floor like a quiet cat. "Watch," she says, and sets her phone screen to pure white, then blocks the slit for a moment with a folded map. The moonstripe pauses, then resumes, but for a breath, a second moonstripe fainter, delayed arrives along the same path before it too fades, like an echo in light. It is not dramatic. It is, frankly, the kind of thing most people would miss while tying a shoe, which makes it both more believable and more unsettling. "That's your 13th, she says softly. Only when the moon and the lantern's internal reflections agree to conspire, and only on certain nights, when the air is unusually dry, we've measured it. We can reproduce it. But there is a second part we cannot command." She leads you into a tiny room, just above the crossing, the hub where nave and transept meet below. Instruments perch on a shelf. A digital lux meter measures light. A pocket magnetometer measures magnetic field. A small barograph draws a slow squiggle of pressure over time, like a nervous lie detector, and a notebook with more sticky tabs than pages. On the wall, a facsimile of a calendar wheel, used by liturgists to calculate movable feasts. It is lovely, baffling, and handmade by someone who resented straight lines. "When the double light appears," Lucia says, tapping the barograph, "the air pressure dips slightly, just a few pascals. Could be night cooling, could be quirk." The lux meter records the second pulse faithfully. And the magnetometer? It shows nothing of interest, which is good. If it spiked, I would resign. You ask why? Because then we'd be in fringe physics country, and I enjoy keeping my job. She closes the notebook and gives you a look that says she knows you're wondering the same thing she is. Why does any of this matter? Why should a civilized person lose sleep over a repeat beam of light in a very old, very large building that contains an organ with more pipes than a polite sentence can handle? Because, she says, the ledger with the double ring note corresponds to a period just after the calendar reform. People were getting used to losing 10 calendar days overnight. Imagine, you go to bed on October 4th and wake up on October 15th, in much of Catholic Europe. The authorities told you it was fine, the sun obliged. But time is cultural as much as it is celestial. And culture hates being told it was wrong. If the building were a person, perhaps this is where it filed a complaint. Lucia can be poetic when she's under-caffeinated. She hands you a slim folder. Photographs of a clock face once installed in a workshop near the basilica. A pale circle of wood, hand-painted numerals I through 3, and a hairline ghost of 13 beneath a scrape of paint, as if someone added a 13th mark experimentally, then thought better of it or was told to. Next to it, an instrument maker's note in cramped Italian, "To catch the extra night," a romantic phrase, or a practical joke, or the working title of a failed thesis. No one knows. Lucia has been asking questions too long to expect neat answers. She likes the messy ones now. All this science and speculation would still be only an amusing footnote if not for the other kind of evidence the Vatican has cultivated for centuries: music. A choir rehearse scales in the distance, soft, off hours. A janitor's radio turned to angel. Lucia smiles. "Music teaches you to hear patterns first and explanations later," she says. During a storm last winter, a sacristan swore he heard 2 Angelus chimes at once, one slightly behind, as if a memory were ringing along with the present. The Angelus is a set of prayers sung or rung at set times, traditionally morning, noon, and evening. If time can echo in sound, perhaps it can echo in light. You are thinking, perhaps, that we have cleverly dodged a conclusion. Correct. Mystery is not a cake you slice neatly into answers. It is tea you steep slowly so the room smells like, what if? But to reassure the practical among you, yes, we will test hypotheses. We will compare humidity readings, trace the path of light through the lantern and a chain of reflective surfaces, model the dome's inner shell with ray tracing, a computer method for simulating light paths. We will overlay lunar ephemerides, tables of the moon's position, on the basilica's geometry. We will ask a Swiss guard to stand exactly where an old drawing shows a watchman with a halberd, a polearm axe, plus spear, designed for enemies taller than your patience. During the 13th hour, because reenactments are good for morale. And yes, we will tell you about St. Peter's bones, or, more soberly, about the excavations beneath the basilica, called the Scavi, where a necropolis, city of the dead, lies under the marble. Roman, pagan and Christian graves, shoulder to shoulder, a reminder that new holy things grow on old ordinary things, like ivy on brick. But that is for later chapters. For now, a breath, a bench, a view up into the mighty ribs of the dome, which lift like vast stone fingers parting the night. Lucia checks her watch not because she trusts it more than the moon, but because she is paid in hours, not moonbeams. It is 12:19 a.m. The first light has passed. In a few minutes, if the sky remains clear, and the street lamps do not offer strong opinions, the second will come. She dims her flashlight until it's a suggestion, and we sit with the measured patience of archivists and cats. While we wait, let me commit a small crime and define one last term: anamorphosis. It is an image warped so that it looks correct only from a particular angle or with a mirror. Renaissance churches hid anamorphic skulls and saints in their corridors like Easter eggs for people with neck pain. If you stand in the wrong place, the picture is nonsense. Move a step and it snaps into clarity. Buildings can hold memories the same way true, but only if you stand where the Maker stood. The 13th hour may be an anamorphosis of time, a fleeting alignment that reveals an extra beat in the basilica's metronome, visible only if you place your body exactly where the past expects you to be. A faint draught moves. The lux meter ticks noiselessly because a merciful engineer muted it, but Lucia's finger taps twice on its glass, a habit older than she is. The floor receives the moon a second time, a nervous ribbon that skates across the brass sun on the landing we saw earlier, and fades as if embarrassed. There, she says. Matter of fact, a scientist witnessing a ghost she invented to prove ghosts don't exist. Repeatable, measurable, slightly ridiculous. You expect a flourish, an organ chord, a chorus. None comes. Mystery prefers to arrive like a librarian, on soft shoes, with paperwork. We gather our questions, which are many, and our conclusions, which are few. Lucia locks the door that isn't on the map. Outside, the colonnade holds its arms around the square. A single Swiss guard nods as we pass, his halberd held with the casual intimacy of someone who has been trained to drop it very quickly if necessary. Do you ever get used to it? You ask. The building? She says. No. The building gets used to you. Eventually it puts you on a shelf where you belong. And then, with a ghost of a smile, because even archivists understand marketing, she adds, if you like puzzles that behave themselves, subscribe. We have 5 more chapters, 20 more instruments, and at least 3 perfectly good theories that will collapse with dignity the moment we test them. We step into Rome's soft night. Somewhere above, the dome exhales. Time, having miscounted itself by 1, pretends nothing happened. The basilica agrees. and the city, which has more centuries than it needs, sleeps anyway. When we left Chapter 1, the moon had done its shy encore, the lux meter had behaved like a well-raised ghost, and Lucia had filed the moment under ridiculous, repeatable. Rome exhaled, which is something the city does on the hour the way other cities honk. By late morning, we are back, armed with the 2 field rations of scholarship, permits and coffee. The permits open doors, the coffee opens everything else. We step past daytime crowds and drift toward a door, where tourists rarely drift without a guide and a strict time slot. The entrance to the scavi, the excavations beneath St. Peter's. If the 13th hour is an echo, Lucia says, perhaps it's echoing off bones. Charming. Down we go, into Rome's favorite paradox. Below the most visited church on earth lies a street for the dead, remarkably alive with plaster, paint, and the sort of quiet you only get when everyone downstairs has paid their respects and moved on. A guide calm, with the patient smile of someone who has explained no photos, 11,000 times nods at Lucia's paperwork and lets us through. The air cools, the light warms, and we are in the necropolis, literally, city of the dead, a Roman burial street, whose brick mausoleums were once open to the sky before Constantine roofed parts of it to lay the first basilica above. In archaeology, this stacking habit is called stratigraphy, reading layers to tell time, like a cake that insists it's a calendar. Orientation, Lucia whispers, pointing her pen like a sword that grades exams. We're just south of where the Apostle Peter is venerated. The modern altar is directly above the confessio, that sunken space where pilgrims kneel to confess their faith and look toward the tomb. Beneath that, a Roman road, flanked by tombs. Church on city, city on graves, graves on older ground. No pressure. It is not evil described panning. Mani Juan Roser. She ticks off titles as we pass painted doorways. Cubicula, small burial rooms. Columbaria, niche-lined walls like dovecotes for urns. And loculi, rectangular slots cut into masonry for bodies, think bookshelves with very quiet books. Frescoes survive here not because Romans loved minimalism, they didn't, but because moisture and sealed spaces conspire to keep color where modern air would generously borrow it forever. At a turn, she points to a slab, scrawled with early Christian graffiti names, please, and something unusually decisive. Petros Eni often read as, Peter is here. Scholars argue, as they must, epigraphy, the study of inscriptions, exists to give linguists a cardio workout. Still, the tradition carefully framed as neither proof nor denial places Peter's veneration in this zone. Over centuries, builders navigated around it like a family rearranging furniture without touching the grand piano. You promised bones, you murmur, because you are a narrative absolutist. Fragments, she says. Venerated bones rarely behave like complete skeletons. They are loved, borrowed, divided, returned, misplaced, found, tested, and argued over. In Rome, even relics have busy schedules. We pause before a tiny marble panel scratched with a sun and lines too crude for art, too intentional for vandalism. Lucia squints. Meridian? Or a child who took geometry personally? She sketches. Hold that shape, she adds. Then ruins your composure by changing subjects entirely. Let's talk Roman hours. She means the lovely, annoying system where daylight was divided into 12 horae temporales, temporary hours, which change length with the seasons. In summer, daytime hours are long and indulgent. In winter, they are short and grumpy. Night gets its own set of 12, equally changeable. When we moderns insist on fixed 60-minute hours, we forget that for most of history, time flexed like bread dough. Sundials were fine with that. People, less so. What if? Lucia says. Our shy encore of moonlight is a residue of that flex architecture tuned for unequal hours meeting our equal-hour clocks. Not magic. Memory. Buildings remember the rules they were born under. Sometimes they keep them in secret, out of sheer stubbornness. We continue along the burial street until a locked iron gate intervenes. Lucia's keys, plural, a personality trait click in order. Past the gate is a low chamber. On one wall, the ghost of a circle. On the floor, a faint groove. Not a meridian line, she says, crouching. A gnomon track? Or a surveyor's guide? In construction, a gnomon can be a projecting pin that casts a shadow, but it can also be an internal reference. The thing that keeps your measurements honest when everything else is lying to you. You look up instinctively, humanity's best move, and remember the obelisk that stands outside in St. Peter's Square, an Egyptian granite needle planted in its current place in 1586 by Pope Sixtus V and the engineer Domenico Fontana. Moving it was the kind of logistical opera that makes modern cranes blush. Legend says Fontana forbade speaking during the lift. When the ropes began to smoke, a sailor named Bresca broke the silence to shout, "Aqua! Water the ropes!" saving the obelisk and earning the right for his family to supply palms on Palm Sunday forever. Whether or not the contract still pays in palm fronds is above our pay grade. The point is, obelisks were often used as oversized gnomons. Their shadows could mark noon, solstices, even calendar corrections. Augustus did it across the river with the Solarium Augusti. Sixtus V, with less desert and more Baroque zeal, used his obelisk to pin the square like a sewing needle through history's lapel. So, you say, enjoying the feeling of being caught up in sensible madness. We have a dome tuned by Renaissance optics, a square governed by an Egyptian needle pretending to be a clock hand, and a necropolis that may or may not be muttering about gnomons. And somewhere in this sympathy orchestra, a 13th hour sneaks through. Love a summary, Lucia says. Hate that it's correct. We emerge from the scavi into the light, which feels rude after polite darkness. Bernini's colonnade, those 4 ranks of travertine columns, curving like a pair of stone arms, frames the sky. 2 ellipses, Lucia reminds us, stand on a marked focus, and the columns align into a single row. That's forced perspective engineering the viewer's sightline so the world behaves for a second. She points to the central granite stripe that runs across the square's paving. Not a meridian, before you ask. But the square's paving does keep secrets if you let geometry do the gossip. We aim for the obelisk. Its base is a textbook pretending to be a pedestal. Bronze lions, inscriptions. A cross planted on a relic capsule. We are in Rome. Relic capsules are like houseplants. On the pavement, there are oval plaques with wind names. The square doubles as a rose of the winds, a compass rose that tells you which way the tramontana would scold your hat if you had one. Navigation, Lucia says. Without arguing with your phone, she checks an app that is not for social media and looks vaguely allergic to it. Ephemerides. She explains tables of celestial positions, sun, moon, planets, where they are, where they were, where they will be. If you want to accuse a beam of light of being dramatic, you need alibis for everyone else in the sky. The moon tonight will be high enough for mischief. The lantern at the top of the dome, glass-clad, ribbed. A gentleman's lighthouse will throw back a little light of its own. Between the two, a few conveniently placed, varnished surfaces inside the drum. A slit or 3 your multipath encore. But Chapter 2 refuses to be content with optics alone. So Lucia commits the sin of connecting dots across centuries. She gestures to the obelisk, and then to the basilica's facade. Sixtus V replanned Rome with obelisks as line-of-sight anchors, she says. Point A talks to point B across the city. Processions marched on straight lines of meaning. Now imagine a similar, smaller choreography inside one building. Lamps, slits, ribs, brass discs, an alignment ritualized by architecture rather than by priests. A tiny liturgy of light that never made it into the missal. You are about to ask how we prove any of this when a boy materializes the way choirboys do, quietly, as if he had been there the whole time, pretending to be a column. He wears the exhausted neatness of someone who rehearses before breakfast. "Signorina Lucia," he says, and holds out a folded paper. On it, staff lines, notes, and a title, Angelus Retro. "We tried it," he adds, as a joke. Singing the Angelus responses backward. It shouldn't work. But from the organ loft, at night, without the organ, there's a resonance, like a second choir, a breath, behind. Acoustics again, you say, defensively loyal to Chapter 1. Architecture again, Lucia corrects, beaming. The basilica is a resonant cavity, a shape that prefers certain frequencies. That's why organs here sound like someone opened a window into heaven's workshop. If you sing a phrase backward, you excite the same frequencies in reverse order. If there are delays, reflections off the drum, the attic, the canopy, you can get a smear that feels like an echoing choir. Combine that with the double light, and you don't just see the 13th hour, you hear it. Multisensory nonsense. My favorite kind. For the terminology fans at home, a standing wave is a pattern that stays put when waves reflect and interfere. In a room, it makes notes boom or vanish depending on where you stand. In a basilica, it can turn a whispered response into a traveling companion. No angels were harmed in the making of this explanation, though several were asked to hold still. We climb again, different route. Same number of stairs, too many. This time, Lucia's key opens a storeroom perched like a swallow's nest above a side aisle. The floor is cluttered with treasures awaiting judgments. A chunk of inscribed marble, a box of worn keys, a bell-maker's wooden mold that smells like smoke and patience. "Profile template," she says, stroking the curve. When you cast a bell, you make a cope and drag two halves of a sand mold around a core. The template controls thickness and curve. After cooling, you tune the bell by shaving metal from precise zones to set the partials, hum, prime, tierce, quint, nominal. Think of it as EQ for bronze. She taps the wood gently. This one's 17th century. The ledger with the double ring note might be its cousin. You notice, carved faintly along the template's rim, a series of tiny marks, 12. And then a 13th, scratched lighter, almost ashamed of itself. A maker testing a superstition, you ask, or testing an isochronism hypothesis, she counters. Clocks rely on isochronism, same period for each swing or vibration. Bells, less so. But if someone believed a night sometimes contained 13 beats, they might have made a bell to flatter that belief, and then been persuaded to pretend they hadn't. By whom? You ask, because your inner conspiracy theorist needs enrichment. By the same force that always edits history, Lucia says primly. Deadlines. She hands you another folder. Inside, a 19th century astronomical drawing, the dome sketched in, section lines splayed from the lantern like porcupine quills, each labeled with dates and declinations. Someone mapped sight lines, she says. Summer moon at major standstill, winter sun at solstice. Equinox dawn glancing from an aisle window onto a railing post. The notes mention precession again. The slow 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis that slides the sky under our coordinate system like a rug under a cat. If you never update your building's sky settings, the sky will eventually file a mischievous update of its own. Before you can congratulate the cosmos on its long-term project management, a Swiss guard appears in the doorway, all courtesy and halberd. "Signorina," he says, "you requested a reenactment?" Of course she did. He stands where an old drawing shows a watchman, by a slit that misbehaves, at the hour Lucia specified in neat block letters. He is good at stillness, which is a martial art in these uniforms. The light does its trick once and almost once again. The boy in the loft hums the Angelus backward as if singing into a fan. The lux meter draws the second blip like a shy heartbeat. The guard, not to be outdone by a photon, tilts his halberd so the blade edge catches the lantern's scatter. For an instant, the slit's second stripe meets the halberd's edge and throws a hairline reflection to the brass disc on the landing below the 12-rayed sun, touching, if only for a blink, the invisible 13th. "Ritual," Lucia murmurs, less as a claim than as a dare. A choreography of materials, bronze, glass, stone, patience. This is where the story could go full seance. Instead, it goes full footnote, because Lucia is constitutionally incapable of letting romance stand without a bibliography. She lays out 3 plausible models on the table, the way a magician shows you the hidden cards and still expects applause. Model A, pure optics. Lantern reflections plus moonlight plus slit geometry equals delayed beam. Adds up. Repeatable. The delay equals extra path length divided by light speed, magnified into visibility by our instruments and our willingness to see what we measure. The Angelus echo? Standard acoustics in a large volume. Verdict. Sensible. Boring. Probably true on most nights. Model B. Optics with calendar memory. Same as A. But note that the strongest repeats cluster on nights when the moon's position approximates where the pre-reform sky would have placed similar events centuries ago. Once you account for calendar shift and precession. In other words, the building's engineered sightlines meet an old schedule, a handful of nights per cycle. Verdict. Poetic and testable. We'll crunch the ephemerides and either thrill or embarrass ourselves. Model C. The bellmaker's joke that wouldn't die. Someone added an extra hour mark to an internal workshop clock, or a template, for calibration. During odd-length night watches, the idea snuck into shop lore, choir lore, guard lore, and is now self-propagating. Once a year, everyone expects a second light, and therefore notices it. Verdict. Culture is contagious. Belief is a better engineer than we admit. Pick any 2, Lucia says. We'll disprove one by dinner. Why not all 3? You ask, intellectually greedy. Because then I'd have to write an article, she says, as if that would be the true tragedy. The boy pads away. The guard nods, the halberd knows it has performed, and retreats into the corridor's painted shadow. Lucia closes her notebook and leans against a coil of rope that has retired honorably from obelisk duty. Time for one last detour language, which is how civilizations leave fingerprints on ideas. Vatican, she says. Likely from Vaticanus, an old toponym for this hill and the plain below. Some like to connect it to Latin vate seer, poet, and vaticinium prophecy. Etymologists hold their noses at romance, but the association is old enough to have its own dust. People were telling fortunes on this hill long before Peter was martyred nearby, possibly in Nero's circus. We do not endorse augury, she adds. with the straight face of a woman who just timed a ghost light with a lux meter. But we respect branding. So, a place named Maybe for seers, that later polices calendars for the world. An Egyptian needle setting noon in a Christian square. A Renaissance dome that listens to the moon like an astronomer who took up stone carving. And under all that, a Roman street teaching us to walk softly where other feet were certain they were the last. As we leave, Lucia detours, of course she does, to a balustrade inside the basilica's upper gallery. The stone rail is polished by centuries of forearms and sermons. On the underside, because the underside is where secrets prefer to live, someone has scratched a tiny compass, rose and a line. At the line's end, almost invisible, a dot and 3 letters, XIII, not a proclamation, not a graffiti shout, more like a label left by a craftsperson who expected the next craftsperson to need it. Hour 13. No exclamation point. People think mysteries live in headlines, Lucia says, but they mostly hide in annotations. We stand a moment longer, letting the basilica breathe around us. Tourists below move like constellations in slow weather. A guide raises a flag, which in this building counts as a liturgical gesture. Somewhere, a conservator sighs over a stubborn patch of soot. Somewhere else, a candle decides drama may resume without it. Tonight, Lucia says, we take the long road. Obelisk shadow at evening. Choir test after Compline. Then the slit, the halberd, the disc. We will also offend a spreadsheet. She pats her satchel. I have lunar standstill tables, humidity logs, ray tracing plots, and a chocolate that has survived 2 papal jubilees. And if the 13th hour doesn't come? You ask, already knowing the answer. It will, she says. Mysteries get stage fright if you demand them. But they are vain enough to appear if you act like you're not watching. On cue, the square outside performs a small miracle of its own. Thousands of feet organize into quiet. The obelisk's shadow lengthens like a cat at dusk, pointing nowhere in particular and everywhere important. The wind that was promised by the paving's compass holds back 1 polite notch. Bernini's arms continue to do what they were carved to do. Keep the city in a long, patient hug. We head for the stairs again, always with the stairs because Chapter 2 has work to deliver to Chapter 3, and chapters, like ours, are only meaningful when they meet where they should. Behind us, XIII keeps its tiny secret under the rail. Ahead, the organ loft, a slit that behaves like a rumor, and a moon rehearsing its lines. If you're still awake, congratulations. You now deserve to sleep in the smug knowledge that your dreams will be built on better footnotes than most people's waking arguments. If you nodded off somewhere around precession, also congratulations. The building forgives you. Either way, subscribe. Lucia insists because there are 4 chapters to go, 2 models to break, 1 ledger to date, and at least 1 choir boy who intends to weaponize harmony in the name of science. There is a particular quiet that follows Compline, the final prayer of the canonical hours, the Church's good night. It is not the silence of emptiness, but of things placed neatly where they belong. Voices cooled. Incense, a memory. Stone returning to its preferred job of being impressive without commentary. Into this hush we lug our most devotional objects. A tripod, 2 notebooks, a coil of gaffer's tape, 1 very patient lux meter, and Lucia's chocolate, which has seen jubilees come and go, and is therefore qualified to serve as morale. You remember the promise from Chapter 1, how the unknown date in the Restorer's note was only unknown because Lucia refused to say until Chapter 3. Consider the drum-rolled reveal. The bellmaker's marginal knight of the double ring, aligns within the sloppiness of old paper and tired hands with the night of the 15th of October 1582, first day of the Gregorian calendar in much of Catholic Europe. The day before was October 4. If your eyebrows just did the wave, correct. 10 dates were deleted to realign civil time with the heavens. See also, Chapter 1's row of wet socks. Lucia's grin is not triumph. It is the thin smile of a historian catching a rumor with a butterfly net labeled citation pending. Is that cause, you ask? Or coincidence, the size of a basilica? We don't do causes before midnight, she says. We do protocols. Lucia's field protocol is a liturgy of tedium. She tapes a rectangle on the floor near the problematic slit control zone. She writes, and another where the second beam nibbles the brass sun target. The lux meter measures illuminance. Lux equals lumens per square meter. In human terms, how much light is landing on this page of your life gets calibrated against a reference panel whose reflectivity, she notes, is albedo 0, 18. Which is science for a gray card photographers use when they don't trust clouds. She selects a logging interval of 1 second. Faster, she says, turns our graph into a chihuahua. Slower, and we miss the wink. The choir boy, his name is Matteo, because of course it is, has brought a tuning fork and the sort of enthusiasm that makes adults remember to be careful with hypotheses around children. He will sing the Angelus retro phrases again, this time on a metronome. For non-musicians, a metronome is a device that turns time into clicks, so musicians can argue about interpretive freedom with more data. A Swiss guard sergeant, Ricci, tonight stands ready at his mark. Halberd polished into a compliance tool for photons. He has agreed, for the sake of science and apocalypse watchers, to tilt the blade edge on Lucia's go to test the reflection onto the brass disc. Safety first, he says, confirming that no one ever trained with a polearm without also training a sense of humor. I set the second tripod near the organ loft to hold a handheld audio recorder. Not because we are chasing ghosts. We are aggressively not chasing ghosts. But because measurements like friends. You get more reliable results when you invite different personalities to the same party. The recorder captures RT60 reverberation time, that is to say, how long it takes a sound to decay by 60 decibels in a room. In a basilica, RT60 is bring a snack. Definitions. Lucia murmurs, half to herself, half to you, because our comments section has both engineers and insomniacs. Candela is the base unit of luminous intensity. Imagine a polite candle that took statistics. Lumen is total light output, how much light the source pours into space. Lux is how much of that soup lands on a surface. Index of refraction is how much a material bends light. Glass has more than air, which is why lenses get away with magnifying secrets. Fresnel reflection describes how light reflects more off a surface when it comes in at a shallow angle. In simple terms, grazing light likes to skate. Matteo looks delighted. Sergeant Ricci looks like a man who has met weirder footnotes on night shift. While our devices pretend they aren't being watched, Lucia gives you a story because that is how good fieldwork passes time. Rome, she says, spent centuries teaching stone to listen to the sky. Jesuit astronomers like Christopher Clavius advised on the Gregorian reform. Later, the Church supported observatories Spicola Vaticana, because if you want to argue with calendars, you must first be on speaking terms with stars. What's Chris? She gestures vaguely east, where the memory of an ancient meridian line in another Roman church runs like a bronze snake along marble Santa Maria degli Angeli e dei Martiri. where Francesco Bianchini cut a pinhole in the wall so high noon would crawl in and kiss the line exactly at the equinox. Meridian lines are time's receipts, Lucia says. They let you prove to your clockmaker that the sun is not negotiating. Architectural aiming is not just about noon. It is about processions, seeing the right thing at the right time. Line of sight planning. One obelisk sighted to another. Facades catching dawn on a feast day. The language of this aiming lives in terms like azimuth, compass direction, altitude, height above horizon, and declination, how far a celestial object sits from the celestial equator. If your eyes are glazing, good. That means sleep is winning. If not, delightful. You're our favorite kind of nerd. We run 3 trials. Trial 1, sky slightly hazy, lantern steady, moon a cooperative witness. The Lux trace does its first polite bump at 0 hours 17 minutes and 8 seconds. A second, smaller swell arrives 0 hours 17 minutes and 19 seconds. 12 seconds apart, close to Lucia's 10 breathing lengths. The audio shows Matteo's backward responses waddling into a smear after each phrase. RT60 tonight is well over 7 seconds in the nave. In the dome's whispering corners, pockets of near-infinite patience create standing waves that behave like cats, present, aloof, convinced they are the mathematicians in the relationship. Trial 2. Lucia changes nothing except Sergeant Ricci's halberd angle. This time, the second light not only appears, it tags the brass sun on the landing below for just under a second. The lux meter at the target zone spikes nothing dramatic, measurable, and smug. Ricci pretends the halberd is indifferent to stardom. Trial 3. She tapes over the slit, gasp, to force the building to show its other roots. The first bump drops, the second vanishes. Optics, she says, and our spreadsheet columns titled Time, Lux, A, Lux, B, Temp, RH%, RT, 60, notes mutters in small green font, offended that magic declined an invitation. For the tech-curious, RH% is relative humidity. Dry air makes clearer reflections. Moist air scatters light and sound, turning everything into soup. Gamma correction, in cameras, deals with how sensors map light to brightness. We avoid it by logging raw lux because sometimes your camera's idea of dramatic is not peer-reviewed. Between trials, Lucia slides a photocopy from her folder with the furtive pride of a person who stole nothing but out-researched someone who had. It's a letter fragment, late 16th century, from a cleric complaining not about heretics or taxes, but about time. I woke in darkness twice between matins and lauds, and thought the bell rung. The sacristan answered that the moon had crossed itself. The date header bears the new style, the 15th of October, 1582, but the correspondent writes, the 5th, as my bones insist, then scratches it out. You waited 2 chapters to tell us this. You accuse gently. I wanted you to like me first, she says, then softens. Also, the fragment is not decisive. The Vatican does not decide doctrine on the basis of one man's insomnia. This Mander died. The narrative and action. We talk about Old Style versus New Style dates, Julian versus Gregorian, and the cognitive whiplash of waking to a new calendar. People say time is money. Lucia shrugs. In 1582, time was politics. Every calendar is a negotiation between astronomy and authority. So did architecture respond? Did masons, choir directors, and bell founders tune their tools to honor old instincts under new rules? No grand edict says so, but you can feel it in the annotations scratched under rails and on templates, the small, stubborn measurements the future wasn't supposed to see. Hour 13. Hour 13. The footnote that learned to walk. Lucia promised ray tracing plots, and she delivers. A sheaf of printouts from a simulation that models light as a million tiny lines bouncing through a simplified dome. She explains it the way kind people explain taxes, briskly, with metaphors. Imagine billiards, but your cue ball is a photon, and the table is a cathedral. Each bounce obeys Snell's law at interfaces, air to glass, and Fresnel coefficients for reflection. We toss rays from the lantern and moon position, let them ricochet off. Known surfaces. The inner shell's paint has a certain specular component, mirror-like, and a larger diffuse component, chalk-like. Every time a ray crosses our target zones, we register a hit. Take concessioners. The plots show a clear primary path and a faint, longer secondary path created by a 2-bounce loop, lantern, glass rib, paint service, window, lintel, slit. The simulated delay, 11 to 13 seconds at our geometry. She didn't cherry-pick. She ran nights across a month. The double hit probability spikes when the moon's azimuth sits within a few degrees of the lantern's major rib alignment, rare, not miraculous. And the calendar? You prod, because you are loyal to romance. The precession drift, she says, plus the 1,582 shift, produce clusters of nights families every so many years when the sky, the lantern, and our slit behave as if old and new schedules overlap. Does the building remember? Buildings don't remember. People do. But people make buildings. She says this, like a person who likes the taste of both poetry and data. Matteo, having aced his part, is rewarded with a tour of the bellmaker's profile template and the vocabulary of bell tone. Lucia, who believes facts should travel in pairs with jokes, recites them like a nursery rhyme. Hum, the low afterglow. Prime, the main note. Tierce, the spicy minor third. Quint, the fifth, heroic by nature. Nominal, the octave above prime that tells your ear what pitch the bell is. Tuning removes metal in rings. Take a bit from here, and the tierce stops sulking. Trim there, and the hum quits hogging attention. If you ever wonder why old bells all sound like they smoked for 4 centuries, copper and tin age, like divas magnificently, with demands. She points to a rubbing of an inscription, a line about time, another about prayer, and a misplaced flourish, almost a 13 ground back, as if the artisan flirted with a 13th marker, then thought, better not. Workshop lore, Lucia says, not doctrine. But lore has a way of seeping into stone. Sergeant Riki, whose night now qualifies for hazard pay in trivia, volunteers a guardroom story. When the square is empty, and fog paces like an old cat, you can hear 2 steps if you walk past the obelisk a certain way, one from your boot, the other from the fog finding its own rhythm a blink later. He shrugs. The city walks with you. He says it like a man who is not surprised when marble edits his stride. Remember RT60? We decide to measure a related creature, EDT, early decay time, which musicians feel as how quickly the room lets go of a note at first. In small rooms, RT60 and EDT are fast and friendly. In Street, Peter's RT60 is a retirement plan. EDT is a promise that if you sing a note, you can move on, and the room will still be sending postcards from that note's vacation. Matteo sings forward, this time proper Angelus. We mark first reflection sound that bounces once off a major surface and returns to the source point. In audio nerdland, flutter echo, rapid snare, like zipping between parallel surfaces, is a problem. Here, curves and coffers erase flutter, but cultivate a different animal. The lateral reflection, arriving from the side, the one that wraps you in stereo hug and makes choirs sound like they invented silk. Reverse singing, Lucia says, therefore doesn't summon demons. It simply stacks familiar frequencies in an unfamiliar order, and the room, recognizing its favorite toys, plays along. Matteo looks both relieved and slightly disappointed. Teenagers are allowed to hope for demons, if only to be brave at them. Lucia finally takes us to the tiny office where the original unknown date restorer kept his notes. It is a monk cell of a room with 2 chairs, a shelf that curves under the weight of paper, the way the dome refuses to under the weight of stars, and a window onto nothing interesting, perfect for work. She pulls a gray box, archival quality, acid-free, the kind of box that looks allergic to romance. Inside, a palimpsest of memos, erasures, additions, coffee rings, the archivist's fingerprint, and a sketch of a clock face with 2 eye end, faint as an afterthought. They're teen under a smear of corrective paint. Here, she says, tracing the reproduction with a pencil she will not let touch the original, is where craft and calendar and comedy meet. Someone once joked, measured, or prayed that the night had an extra beat. Then someone else edited the joke or the measurement out. But not quite. The edit shadowed itself. 9 self-live. 9 self-live. Archival practice, explained gently. Provenance, where the record came from. Original order, how the creator arranged it. Respect de fonds, do not mix creators' records, leave them in their families. Lucia lives by these rules because they are how we avoid telling lies with tidy binders. Every deletion, she says, is an opinion about what the future deserves to know. We deserve to know a little, apparently. She admits that the unknown date footnote was her impatience with certainty. Scholars before me placed the double ring near the calendar reform, she says. I wanted instruments on the floor before I handed you romance. It's so money livent, was one not held. We step out to the square for the earlier piece of tonight's choreography. The obelisk's shadow stretches toward the colonnade like a polite accusation. Bernini sprinkled wind roses on the pavement oval plaques named Tramontana, Grecale, Levante old friends who tell sailors which direction their excuses will come from. Children hop between them, because children always discover city design with their feet first. As dusk rationalizes colors into fewer decisions, Lucia traces the granite's shade with a finger that is not touching the stone. Conservators keep her honest even in absentia. Obelisks as gnomons are simple, she says. They measure the sky by having the decency to be tall. The Solarium Augusti across the river once tried to tell time and calendar with a giant sundial. It failed elegantly because the Campus Martius flooded and because Romans discovered that astrology throws better parties than astronomy. The obelisk is now a Christian exclamation point, topped with a cross. Its base whispers Egyptian gods in granite, if you listen with bad Latin. Its top whispers, "We won," if you listen with Baroque ears. Objects survive by changing jobs. Does the obelisk's shadow align with anything special tonight? No thunderclap, but the line it paints at evening grazes a paving stripe that, extended, noses the basilica's facade, where a later architect, with or without permission from geometry, placed a discreet plaque. On that plaque, almost invisible under weather and piety, 13. Lucia swears she didn't plant it. I wouldn't carve Roman numerals into Bernini's square, she says. I like my career. Midnight approaches. Instruments yawn and stretch. The lantern keeps its gentlemanly glow. Clouds negotiate with Rome and decide to be elsewhere. Matteo hums his part. Ricci stands with a halberd that has never felt so integral to photometry. Lucia watches the slit as if it owed her money. First beam. On time. Because time loves to show off when observed. Second beam. 12 seconds later. Not brighter, but more decisive. As if the building, having been measured, is now performing its compliance training. The lux meter plots a hill. The audio recorder, faithful gossip, captures a faint second angel just behind the first. The brass sun on the landing accepts its 1-second starlight. Our protocol sings. Lucia does not cheer. She checks a box. She writes, in neat small script, repeatable with slit, vanishes when occluded. Delay matches ray tracing. Audible smear consistent. Ricci blade reflection successful. Note. Relative humidity 37%. Then, indulgently, calendar rumor still refusing to be either dead or alive. Schrodinger's bell. You ask the question that honest stories must permit. Is that it? The mystery is optics and acoustics, and Roman scheduling anxiety? Mostly, she says. Plus the human talent for apophenia seeing patterns, and the human wisdom to use that talent as a ladder, then kick the ladder away and keep the view. She softens. But do not underestimate the importance of mostly. Mostly is where we live. Mostly is where we sleep. And the one saw. Then even into ever unbraid. Before we leave, Lucia walks you to the dome's inner gallery and points to a painting barely anyone looks at, crowded as it is by greater glories. A saint holding a small instrument that looks like a flattened clock with a rotating grate. Astrolabe, she says again, but this time as benediction. A human made this to talk to the sky. Then another human made a basilica that by accident or obedience keeps a tiny appointment with that sky long after the appointment book changed. If you explain it, and then still feel the hair rise on your arm when the second light arrives, you have understood physics correctly. We pack the gear. Matteo takes a selfie with Ricci's halberd-approved angle. No blade near anything that would earn paperwork. The basilica exhales a sound like stone remembering to be warm by day again. Lucia leaves a note for morning staff that reads, in archivist tone, small tape markings. Do not remove experiment ongoing. Then, less professionally, she adds a smiley face, which is the universal symbol for I owe you coffee. At the door that does not exist on the tourist map, she pauses. 4 chapters left, she says, and we haven't even offended the Vatican Observatory yet, or played with the gnomon at Santa Maria degli Angeli, or asked whether the lunar standstill cycle in 18, 6-year wobble in moonrise, divided by set extremes, flirts with our geometry. Also, one ledger still needs dating properly. Paleography party. You ask if the 13th hour will keep appearing now that we've measured it so rudely. It's Rome, she says. It will ghost us for a week out of spite. Then show up precisely when you've left your notebook at home. We step into the square. The obelisk wears darkness like a formal coat. Bernini's arms continue to hug people who do not know they are being hugged. Somewhere, a janitor clicks off a light, and a candle decides that drama is a team sport. On our way past the colonnade, Lucia points to a barely visible scratch on a travertine drum, older than she is, younger than most stones here. XIII again, tiny tidy, a whisper that learned to carve. Subscribe, she says, not bothering to dress it as a suggestion. Next time we chase the meridian across town, make a Jesuit proud, date a ledger by its umlauts, and test whether an anamorphosis of time can be photographed without lying. Sleep if you can, Bring your curiosity if you can't. Behind us, the dome holds its breath. Ahead, Chapter 4 stretches like the obelisk's shadow at dawn, longer than it should be, and exactly the right length for the day we're about to have. Morning in Rome tastes like espresso and ambition. Lucia drinks both. Today, she declares, we prove noon, date a rumor, and attempt to photograph an angle that only exists if you stand in exactly the wrong place. Bring your skepticism. And your knees. We start not at St. Peter's, but across town in a church that smugly occupies what used to be the baths of Diocletian, Santa Maria degli Angeli e dei Martiri. Its interior hosts a gigantic scientific flex from the early 1700s, the Bianchini meridian. Imagine a bronze line across the floor, zodiac signs inlaid like a polite horoscope, and high up near the cornice a tiny hole in the wall. At true solar noon on a sunny day, a tight sunbeam drops through that gnomon, the pinhole, and crawls across the line to kiss the date mark. It's astronomy with Renaissance swagger and monastic patience. House rules, Lucia says, kneeling by the line. Meridian, the north-south great circle. Solar noon, when the sun crosses that meridian, where you stand rarely at 12 on your wrist, because of the equation of time, Earth's orbit is mildly eccentric, and its axis tilted, so sundial time wobbles around, clock time by up to 16 minutes. Declination. The sun's angular distance from the celestial equator. It's why the beam marches differently in June versus December. In summary, the sky is tidy. Our clocks are tidy. They are not the same tidy. The beam arrives like a punctual cat. Children gasp. An adult whispers science the way other people whisper miracle. Lucia sketches, efficient even while being charmed. This, she says, is how a building keeps appointments without batteries. It also reminds us that light traces paths we can predict, down to the inch, if we measured the hole, the height, the line, the latitude, and the patience. Jesuits? You ask. Remembering last night's name-dropping, Francesco Bianchini wasn't Jesuit, but the church loved gentlemen who could do math on marble. Meanwhile, Jesuits excelled at teaching the sky to undergraduates and the calendar to kings. Together, they invented the polite Roman hobby of aligning architecture with heaven and then pretending it was easy. Outside again, Rome does its jangly daylight thing. Lucia points us a few blocks to Sant'Ignazio di Loyola, a Jesuit church that turned anamorphosis into a parlor trick for God. The dome? Not a dome. A flat canvas painted by Andrea Pozzo to look like a dome if, and this is important, you stand on a brass disc set in the floor. A second disc gives you a different illusion. The ceiling opens to an infinite heavenly plaza as long as your neck signs the liability release. Definitions break. Lucia narrates. Because she is incapable of not narrating. Anamorphosis. An image warped to appear, correct only from one vantage or via a mirror. Forced perspective. Geometry bullying your eyes for noble ends. Moral. If a flat ceiling can pretend to be a dome with enough calculus and paint, a basilica can pretend to have a 13th hour with enough ribs, glass, and moonlight. The trick isn't fraud. It's choreography. A custodian smiles at our reverent mischief. We stand on the disc and watch illusions snap into place. Step off it, and the dome melts back into a talented lie. Hold that feeling, Lucia says. That's the sensation we'll try to photograph tonight. Reality that only behaves when you stand just so. After lunch long enough to offend modern productivity, we retreat to an archive workroom where the air smells like good paper and good decisions. On the table, the bellmaker's ledger copy we saw before, plus higher resolution images from the original. Our job, date the margin note, the night of the double ring, and figure out who wrote the little ghost of their teen that someone then tried to erase. Lucia lays out her kit. A raking light lamp, a linen tester, the magnifier librarians trust more than your cousin's smartphone, and a sheet that looks like bingo for nerds. Paleography primer, she says, tapping squares like an airport bingo caller. We date handwriting by ductus, how letters are formed, and in what stroke order, letter forms, the look ofs, numerals, ligatures, joined letters, orthography, spelling, choices, and material clues, watermarks in the paper, chain lines and laid lines, the rib impressions from paper molds, plus ink behavior, iron gall inks, eat paper slowly. They also halo when over-inked. She tilts the page. Faint ripples surface. Chain lines about 25 millimeters apart, running vertically. Italian Fabriano mills often give you this spacing and a watermark. See? A little glove with a star. That points to late 1600s, early 1700s for this sheet batch. She points to the funky long S before a consonant, but the final S looks like ours. The numerals are transitional open top 4, curly 7, with a crossbar that flirts like French, and the 13 is in a different brown, likely a later hand. The umlaut? She grins. There's a tiny gello tet in pencil, German for rung, added by a 19th century cataloger. Hence my umlaut joke yesterday. Archivists leave breadcrumbs. Some of them wear lederhosen. So the 13 and the phrase double ring weren't contemporaneous? Likely not, she says. The phrase appears in the original 1600s ink. The faint 13 looks penciled over later, then partially rubbed. My guess, a 19th century restorer teasing a workshop rumor or measuring on a practice dial, and another restorer, allergic to folklore, tried to clean it. Both lacked our modern respect for leaving the crime scene intact. She flips to a second folio. Bell tuning notes. Tierce sharp by a comma, quint heavy. She translates. They're shaving metal from the sound bow that's the thickest part of the bell, like surgical dietetics for bronze. No 13 anywhere near the bell founder's times. But there is a note about night watches lengthening in winter. Uneven hour lengths poking their head in again. Our mystery loves old schedules. Very doin' one broth. Twilight. We return to Street Peters, with contraptions that make tourists assume we are either geniuses or the reason signs exist. Lucia hands me a cardboard rectangle with a narrow slit cut through it and a camera that looks like it has opinions. We're doing slit scan, she says. Photo trick. Instead of exposing the whole sensor at once, we expose a slit over time so motion becomes shape, used for races to see who actually crossed first, and for making pedestrians into surreal lasagna. Why? Because our 13th hour isn't a brighter light, it's a secondary path that arrives later. A normal long exposure makes both beams look like one fat shrug. Slit scan lets time smear sideways so we can separate the two routes. She sets the rig. Camera on tripod, slit aligned with the beam's crawl. Exposure 1 minute, ISO low to keep noise from pretending to be metaphysics. Rolling shutter warning, she adds. Most digital sensors read top to bottom. Fast motion turns straight things into bananas. We want the banana time bending into a trace we can measure. Matteo, on the loft again, has brought a tuner app because he is Gen Z and refuses to apologize. Sergeant 8 LOP. Ricci is the halberd again, having accepted that his weapon is now a specular reflector with a costume budget. The lux meter hums along in silence, logging lux, temp, RH%, like a little bureaucrat. First exposure. The primary beam paints a clean stripe across the slit. 12 seconds later, the secondary arrives. On the live view, the stripe appears double, two parallel tracks slightly offset like train rails for photons. Lucia grins like a cat that discovered daylight savings. Path length difference visualized, she says. Primary traveled via A, secondary via ABC. Distance difference divided by C. The speed of light gives our delay. We're cheating by using a slow shutter to stretch microseconds into art. Copyright. Physics. We bracket a second shot with Ricci's blade tilted. A delicate hairline third trace jumps to the brass disc target, fainter but cooperative. Matteo sings Angelus Retro in tempo. The audio recorder paints time into a waterfall of decays. Lucia overlays the audio spectrogram on her light graph on her phone, which is the sort of multitasking that gets you promoted in both labs and monasteries. Gamma stays off, she says to herself, disabling the camera's tone curve. If we let software help, it invents feelings for our shadows. She jots. Slit orientation, 87 degrees, exposure 60 seconds, delay 12.3 seconds, RH% 35, temp 18.9 degrees Celsius, wind nil. You've never seen a person so happy to write wind nil. In what rematted, the ruse in exegist between exposures. Lucia lectures cheerfully about apophenia, our brain's habit of finding patterns in noise. It's not a bug. It's why we recognize faces and seasons. Science weaponizes apophenia with controls and blinds, so our enthusiasm doesn't adopt stray coincidences. Tonight, controls. Tape over slit equals no second beam. Cloudy night equals nothing. Wrong halberd angle equals no blade reflection. Blinds. Matteo sings without telling me where in the phrase he breathes. Instruments vote without caring who else wins. And the calendar blink? You ask. Stubbornly loyal to Chapter 3. Still a rumor, she says. But we can test it. Look at nights near October, 1 Fivnu style, across decades. Check moon azimuth clusters. Compare with the building's reflective geometry. If there's a weak periodicity tied to lunar standstill, 18.6-year cycle, when moonrise extremes max out, that's a tidy place for romance to hide behind math. She pulls a folded chart, declination versus azimuth at our latitude, neat bands where the moon likes to pose, and a scribble labeled lantern rib alignment plus or minus 3 degrees. If these cross on nights near our calendar anniversaries more often than chance, she says, I will publish while pretending it was obvious. To the doll den. On our break, we glance at the Pozzo ceiling on Lucia's phone. She snapped it this morning. Andrea Pozzo taught Rome to love lies told at the right angle, she says. He wrote a textbook, Perspectiva Pictorum et Architectorum. Translate that as how to bully space with lines and get away with it. She swipes to our slit scan photo. Double rail of light. Tonight is basically Perspectiva Photonica. She deadpans. How to bully time with a slit and get a graph. Matteo yawns in Latin. Ricci pretends not to. The Basilica, as always, chooses dignity. We run a final controlled set. Lucia moves the slit 10 centimeters left. The secondary rail fails to appear. Move it back. The rail returns. She flips the slit 90 degrees. The rails merge into one blur. Geometric dependency, she notes. Second path is a line, not a blob. If this were sensor noise or prayer, it would not care about slit placement. She overlays the slit scan tracks onto her ray tracing printout. The match is indecently good. Jesuit approved, she says, then adds quickly, unofficially, please don't mail them. Matteo, satisfied, switches the tuner app to a sine sweep from 100 Hz to 1000 Hz and plays it quietly. The room sketches back its favorite notes, our recorder logs, room modes, frequencies that resonate in this geometry. The spectrum looks like the city skyline of an empire that hates right angles. These are the notes the basilica hums to itself when left alone, Lucia whispers. If we were poets, we'd say the second light arrives on a building's vowel. If we are nerds, and we say, the acoustics confirm surface reflectivity and volume. Ricci, who has been a reflective surface par excellence, asks a question so practical it should be bronzed. Will you write all this down where a night guard can read it without a dictionary? Yes, Lucia says, with diagrams and snacks. Back in the workroom, she reveals her last trick. Remember that penciled 13 under paint? A conservator friend scanned it with multispectral imaging, shining different wavelengths and photographing the responses. Old inks absorb differently at, say, infrared 850 nanometers, Lucia says. Graphite reflects differently than iron gall. Painted retouches sulk at ultraviolet. Result: layers. The processed images show the 13 faint but legible pencil, later hand. Under it, nothing, no erased original 13. In the margin near double ring, there's a doodled clapper, a tiny bell tongue by the original scribe. He meant the sound, not the clock face, Lucia concludes. The clock with 13 was a 19th century restorer's workshop test. Our beloved rumor is two events sharing a folder by accident. As with two of, you feel a small, honest pang. Lucia sees it and nods. Welcome to archives, she says. The truth is usually smaller than the story and exactly as beautiful. The 13th hour exists as an optical delay path, reproducible, photographable, geometry-dependent. The acoustic echo is room physics. Standing waves, lateral reflections. RT60, doing its cathedral thing. The calendar blink remains a probable cultural echo. Night watches changing. Calendars leaping. Ledgers sighing. No proof of cosmic rebellion. Some proof of human stubbornness. The ledger, original, double ring, 1600s, later pencil, 13, 1800s, now traced by multispectral scans, umlaut, courtesy of a German cataloger who liked helpful clarity and tiny dots. Nothing supernatural, you say, have to test the room, have to tuck the blankets. Nothing paranormal, Lucia corrects. Plenty preternatural, the old word for things that feel beyond normal until you learn the mechanism. Then they're normal with better lighting. She snaps the last shot for the night. The double rail, clean as a confession. That, she says, is the photo I will frame badly at my desk. On the way out, we pass a tiny stone scratch under the gallery rail, our friend XIII. I ask whether she'll file a note to conserve it. Already did, she says. Label. Craft mark. Undocumented. Do not overclean. Archivists are the sort of romantics who write love letters as preservation directives. Outside, Bernini's colonnade hugs the square like a parent who knows you're pretending not to be tired. The obelisk minders lock their cabinets. Rome resets itself to mostly the only category that matters past midnight. Next, Lucia says, we go visit the Vatican Observatory's archives, argue with a 19th century star catalog, and annoy a mathematician with lunar standstill regressions. Also, a Swiss guard promised me access to a roof plank with mirror polish from a restoration. You can guess what I want to bounce off that. And if the second light doesn't show tomorrow, you ask. It will sulk, she says. Then it will arrive, when no one is filming, to protect its dignity. Which is why, she stops, looks directly at you, and commits the only miracle this story allows. You should subscribe. I cannot bribe the moon. I can, however, promise snacks, footnotes, and an hour that refuses to pay rent, but always shows up for work. The dome recedes behind us like a planet. The city purrs. Somewhere, a pencil adds 2 dots over an A and turns certainty into a vowel that smiles. You would think, after photographing an hour that refuses to sit still, that the sensible thing would be to sleep. Lucia has a different definition of sensible. Today, she says, throwing an espresso at the morning, we bully the moon with math, bounce light off a roof plank from 1890, and ask the observatory very politely to disagree with us. She pockets a notebook, a polarizing filter, and the kind of optimism usually reserved for grant proposals. The plan is threefold. 1. Run regressions on our light delay data against lunar standstill geometry. 2. Borrow a mirror finish plank from a restoration cache to test whether a high specular surface in the dome could be amplifying our second beam. And 3. Take the short walk philosophically, not geographically, to the Vatican Observatory archives, to see whether anyone smarter already solved our riddle and moved on to comets. The Vatican Observatory, today headquartered at Castel Gandolfo, with a research group also in Arizona, is the sort of institution that proves the following truth. If you want your calendars to be right, you have to like stars professionally. The bit we visit is a Rome reading room, climate-controlled whispers, a librarian whose eyebrows can shelve you by subject, and beautiful old volumes that smell like patience. An astronomer named Brother Paolo, round glasses, dry wit, sins forgiven by math, meets us with the air of a man who knows that tonight we will say precession too many times. You have a moon delay, he says, already amused. You want to see if the heavens file paperwork in 18.6-year cycles and whether your basilica is complicit. Correct. Lucia smiles, setting down our graphs like a cat laying a mouse at the feet of a tolerant friend. Also, we brought cannoli. Paolo studies the plots. Your delay is consistent with a secondary path length difference of a few meters, he says. You modeled it. Good. Does it cluster near certain lunar declinations? We think, Lucia says, and produces a folded chart like a magician revealing a rabbit that did its own statistics. She's run a preliminary regression. Delay seconds, tilde-phazimuth, altitude, humidity, with a dummy variable for near standstill season. The p-values, that fickle tribe, suggest our standstill season term is small but not imaginary. Explain standstill, Paolo prompts, for the sake of our audience and the librarian's conscience. The moon's path wobbles, Lucia says. Its orbit is tilted about 5 degrees to the ecliptic. The line of nodes where its path crosses the ecliptic precesses backwards over 18.6 years. At major standstill, the moon rises and sets at its most extreme north and south points on the horizon. At minor standstill, least extreme. These extremes change the moon's azimuth at a given altitude. Translation. Some nights the moon feels extra ambitious. Other nights it keeps to the center lane. If our slit, ribs, and lantern have preferred angles, standstill seasons should slightly increase the odds of the secondary path completing its 2-bounce pilgrimage. Paolo nods. Small effect, credible. The dome is not an observatory, but it is an optical system whether it wishes to be or not. Beware of overfitting, that is. Don't let your regression model learn your dreams. Lucia's grin acknowledges the sermon. "We'll test on held-out nights," she says. "Promise." The librarian brings a folio. Lunar ephemerides from the 19th century. In the margin, someone has jotted "stand still" and drawn a tiny moon with dramatic eyeliner. Humans have always annotated the sky with affection. We photocopy politely, leave a canolo as tithe, and head for the roof. The roof is not a place for tourists. It is where roofs do roof things, collect dust, glare at gulls, and host quiet maintenance miracles. Waiting for us is Sergeant Richie, who now wears a cap that says "Facilities," with the dry swagger of a man who polices both photons and pigeons. He presents a plank the length of a saint and the weight of a confession. Its top face is burnished nearly to a mirror, a relic from Restoration scaffolding c. 1890 seconds, plane so smooth that light decides friction is beneath it. "Specular versus Lambertian," Lucia says. "Because now is apparently a great time for surface physics. A Lambertian surface reflects light equally in all directions. Think chalk, matte paint. It looks equally bright, from any angle. A specular surface reflects like a mirror angle in equals, angle out. You only see the glare if you stand where the geometry lets you. Real-world surfaces are in between. The fancy way to describe that is BRDF, bidirectional reflectance distribution function, a $5 phrase for how shiny behaves." Ricci repeats, "BRDF, with the gravity of a man learning a new parade command. We do not deserve him. We set the plank at a height and tilt corresponding to an internal ledge we suspect of being shinier than decorum." Lucia slaps a polarizing filter onto the camera sunglasses for lenses, selective about glare. Polarization separates specular highlights, which are often polarized, from diffuse return, which isn't. If the second beam is boosted by a shiny surface, rotating this filter will modulate it more than the primary. Trial 1. Plank bare. Filter at 0 degrees. Primary beam behaves. Secondary seems a tad proud of itself. Trial 2. Rotate to 90 degrees. The secondary weakens perceptibly, while the primary barely blinks. Lucia crows, academically. "Specular contribution confirmed," she says. Somewhere up their ledge, varnished rib, smug window, lintel, our second path is getting mirror help. There is rained grossed, Paolo, who has come along because cannoli are portable. Notes, mild atmospheric refraction. Affects light bending through air, layers of different temperature and density, too small to explain the delay. Large enough to make him feel helpful. Also, he adds, you're near a big hunk of warm stone. Thermals move, refractive index varies. On some nights, your secondary path may be decohered, smeared by turbulence. Translation. The basilica sighs heat. The air answers with low drama. Your graph gets messy. Science is a polite argument with mess. Back at a table that pretends to be horizontal. Everything here is slightly Baroque. We set up the model. Variables. Deltat, our delay. As, moon azimuth. Alt, moon altitude. RH, relative humidity. Temp, wind. A binary halberd. 1 if Ricci played lighthouse. 0 if not. And a categorical standstill window, 1 during plus or minus 6 months of major standstill years, 0 otherwise. Lucia adds interaction terms because she cannot help herself. As times stand still, alt times RH. Explanations for viewers who fell asleep at regression and woke at plot, she says, kind. A regression estimates how much each factor nudges our outcome, holding others constant. It does not prove cause, it suggests influence. We check residuals, the errors for patterns. If residuals look like a conspiracy, Our model is wrong. We feed the numbers. The screen blinks a result that would make a statistician shrug and a poet sigh. As is significant. Do. RH is negative. Wetter nights blur reflections. Standstill window is small but positive. And halberd is, to Ricky's quiet satisfaction, a robust effect. His blade makes a measurable difference because it adds an intentional specular bounce. Publishable? Paolo asks. Respectable, Lucia says, not divine. She saves the script with a file name that will mock future her. Moon. Delay. Please. Work. Final 2. IPINB. We run cross-validation train on one set of nights, test on another. The model doesn't collapse. We call that victory and refuse to look smug. Overfitting avoided for now, Lucia notes. The moon remains unbribed. We take a detour to sanity. Noon. At Santa Maria degli Angeli, the moonbeam kisses the meridian line, 3 minutes late by your wristwatch. This is the equation of time flexing. Sundial noon versus clock noon. A docent explains to a baffled tourist that means solar time, clocks, averages the sun's misbehavior over a year, while apparent solar time, sundials, reports the drama live. The tourist nods politely. The sun, unashamed, continues to be elliptical. Why do this? You ask, gesturing to a beam of photons doing its job without supervision. Because, Lucia says, it teaches you that time is local. A basilica is not a lab, but it keeps local appointments with the sky. Our 13th hour is one such appointment, a minor tea with the moon and a sheet of varnish. She looks genuinely happy. It's unsettling. Night again. Matteo returns with an acoustic curiosity, a Schulmerich tuning fork set that lets him excite exact frequencies without melody. If the room has favorite notes, he says, let's ring them without the romance. He pings 262 Hz near middle C. The recorder captures a spectral peak that decays at a dignified pace. He pings 330 Hz, E 392 Hz, G. The spectrum shows blooms that correlate with architectural volumes. Nave, aisles, drum. We map room modes crudely by walking with the microphone. The peaks swell and shrink like polite whales. During a second beam event, the recorder shows a small spectrotemporal smear, a faint delayed twin of the high-frequency energy in Matteo's whisper. Not angels. Just a very big room telling a small room story. Reverse singing wasn't magic, Matteo says, resigned to being brilliant instead. It was convolution my signal convolved with the room's impulse response. Explain, Lucia prompts. Barista of metaphors. Imagine the room as a filter, Matteo says. You pour sound in, the room stretches, delays, and colors it. If you clap, the impulse response is the clap's ghost, the pattern of echoes. Convolution is the math that applies that ghost to any sound. Reverse the sound, and you poke the same ghost in a different order. The ghost does not mind. Bless you, Lucia says, and gives him a cookie. Ricci, whom we now suspect of a side degree in optics, wants to know why his blade helps. Lucia hands him a paper napkin and draws a Fresnel curve, reflectance versus incident angle. At shallow angles, even dull metal reflects a lot, she says. Your halberd's edge is curved. You're presenting a near-grazing incidence to the stray photons. A small tilt can redirect a faint sheet of light onto our target. Also, the blade has a higher refractive index contrast than stone-air boundary. It wins the Be Shiny contest. Do I get a certificate? He asks. You get immortality as a footnote, Lucia promises. Which is better? Paper lasts longer than plaques. We spend 20 minutes chasing suspects we can dismiss just to make our spreadsheet feel loved. Airglow, the faint emission of the upper atmosphere too diffuse, too steady. City light pollution omnipresent but not path differentiated. The filter test discounted it. Scattered starlight, adorable, irrelevant. Electromagnetic interference. The magnetometers stayed boring. Good magnetometers aspire to boredom. CCD sensor weirdness we shot raw. Check 2 cameras. Compared dark frames. Photos with the lens cap on. The second rail vanished with the slit taped, therefore not a sensor hallucination. Sometimes science is just a list of things that declined the invitation, Lucia says. The ones who RSVP'd are enough. Lucia cannot leave paper alone. Back in the archive room, she runs a raking light pass again, this time angling the lamp to tease micro-reliefs from the margin. The pencil 13 shows graphite sparkle tiny mica glints. The older ink note, double ring, bleeds minutely along the paper fibers. Classic iron gall behavior, confirming separate hands. She sketches the watermark more precisely. The glove has a cuff flourish used by a Fabriano mill.c. 1,690, 1,710. Our double-ring scribe lived around then, she says. The penciled 13 vandalism likely 1800s. No secret 1,582 original, just later romance scribbled on an older rumor. Which is still charming, Paolo says, adopting the rumor for the observatory the way an uncle adopts a stray cat. We repeat the slit scan with the polarizer at multiple angles, logging the secondary's response. The resulting family of images is curiously beautiful. A bouquet of parallel rails, thickness changing with polarization like mood rings for moonlight. Lucia overlays a Mueller matrix diagram 8 boxes, explaining how polarizers and retarders transform polarized light, and immediately apologizes. Too much, she says. Delete that. Keep this. The secondary beam is partly polarized specular. The primary is mostly diffuse. Therefore, surfaces matter. I ask what we will call the photo when we publish it online, where it will be promptly stolen by moodboard accounts. Lucia considers. The Basilica teaches a second hand to a clock, or 13th rail, or just, mostly. We have models, images, regressions, and Ricci's blade. We still do not have a memo from 1698 saying, we carved a slit to catch the moon twice for fun. We likely never will. Architecture keeps many secrets not because it is malicious, but because masons were busy. Lucia writes the honest list on a card and tapes it above her desk. Known. Second beam equals optical 2-bounce path, boosted by specular surface. Delay matches simulation. Appears under dry, calm conditions within a narrow azimuth band. Polarization behavior confirms shiny culprit. Halberd adds third controlled bounce. Likely. Slight clustering near standstill seasons. Cultural memory. Double ring. Tied to night watch practice. Plus calendar transition anxieties. Unknown. Original intent of the slit. Date of shiny surfaces installation. Whether any liturgy ever noticed and codified the effect. Who carved XIII under the rail, and why so tidily. Unnecessary but delightful. Choirboy, reverse hymn works as an acoustics demo. Obelisk sightlines accidentally gossip with the facade plaque with 13. Pozo would have approved of our photographic bullying. She takes a breath that makes you realize you were holding yours. 2 notes, she adds. First, We'll run the model on major versus minor standstill, years explicitly. If the coefficient flips as expected, we'll earn our smugness. Second, I want the roof plank scanned for residual varnish chemistry. If a 19th century resin was used in the dome, it may explain the mirror patches. Resin? Ricci says. Because he collects new nouns like stamps. Shellac, copal, damer historical varnishes, Lucia says. Their refractive indices live between 1.5 and 1.6. That's shiny country. If a rib or lintel was sealed to stop dusting masonry, it could have become a stealth mirror. Paolo nods. Bring me a flake, he says gently. Not from Michelangelo. We owe you a lullaby, since this is still a story for sleep. Here it is. The human brain is a Bayesian machine. It updates beliefs as evidence arrives. You came with priors. Maybe there's a 13th hour. We added data. Rays, rails, delays. Your posterior belief is now, there is a second beam most nights under certain conditions. The calendar rumor is cute. The moon has hobbies. That, dear traveler, is how one dozes off, with better priors than one woke with. If you slept through the math, your neurons did a quiet update anyway. Brains, the original background process. For our last test of the night, we do something theatrical to justify your subscription. Lucia covers the slit with a linear polarizer film and rotates it slowly during the expected window. The primary beam, mostly diffuse, barely changes. The secondary bright dims obediently. Matteo whispers, it's waving, as if the basilica were flirting. Ricci grins with a professional's appreciation for controlled outcomes. Lucia writes one line, in neat archival hand, into her notebook. Second path, partially polarized. Slit polarizer modulation confirms specular boost. Delay stable. Humidity low. Jesuits would have been unbearable. She draws a tiny XIII in the margin, then scolds herself and adds, parenthetically, annotation, joke. Archivists cope with humor. Stone copes with patience. As we pack, Paolo glances up at the dome. You know, he says, for all our jargon, it's simply this. The building found a way to whisper, look to anyone paying attention at an inconvenient hour. You looked. It worked. Outside, the square folds into itself like a great animal at rest. Bernini's colonnade keeps hugging whoever walks beneath, including pigeons who refuse to sign consent forms. The obelisk points at nothing and everything, which is its job. The wind chooses Levante tonight. A soft eastern rumor. Somewhere, the gnomon at Santa Maria degli Angeli dreams of noon with professional pride. Tomorrow, Lucia says, we do the unglamorous thing. Write it up in plain language for the night staff. Diagram the halberd angle so no one loses an eye to physics, and draft a note for the observatory with our regression, so a real astronomer can say either brava or nope. Then, Chapter 6. History. We braid Peter's Hill, Nero's Circus, Sixtus's obelisk, calendar fights, and the craft marks under the rail into a story that behaves. No incense, just incense-shaped facts. And if the 13th hour takes a vacation, you ask, suspicious of narrative karma. It will, she says. But the graphs don't, and neither does mostly. De-eminence, de-eminence, de-eminence. She pockets the polarizer, salutes Ricci with the seriousness this blade deserves. Fist bumps Matteo like a scientist who has learned to accept applause in the key of E, and turns to you with the world's softest call to action. Subscribe, sleep, and bring your curiosity back. We are almost done, which is the nicest lie a mystery can tell before it becomes a history. The dome breathes. The city purrs. A pencil somewhere lifts to add 2 dots over an A, because certainty is prettier with umlauts. Morning again, because mysteries insist on pretending they have offices. Lucia has done the unglamorous parts, cleaned graphs, labeled photos, wrote a memo titled Halberd as Specular Aid, Safety and Angle, which is the kind of sentence you only get to write once in a career and then frame badly. Our last chapter is not about catching the 13th hour. It is about giving it relatives. Stories that end well introduce their parents. We begin where so many Roman arguments begin, a hill that was not fashionable until it suddenly was. Vaticanus, the slope and plain across the Tiber, lay outside the old Pomerium, Rome's sacred boundary. Marshy in spots, industrial in mood, good for things the city pretended it did not do. Here stood Nero's circus, a racetrack and spectacle machine. Tradition elastic, stern, says the Apostle Peter suffered martyrdom nearby, upside down by his request. Whether or not an exact stake may be GPS'd, the Scavi below street, Peter's preserve a truth older than maps. In the centuries that followed, Christians returned to this ground to remember, then to mark, then to build. Constantine built the first basilica, 4th century. A timber-roofed nave aimed like a finger at the saint's memory, leveling parts of the necropolis, roofing others. To raise the floor, they filled spaces with rubble and intention. Medieval centuries, layered chapels over chapels, like whispers over whispers. In the 16th century, after debates that could have been operas, a Renaissance answer arrived. Tear down, mostly. Build anew, entirely. Make a church so large that future architects would experience character development just by entering. Bramante sketched a Greek cross plan that was less a plan than a boast. Michelangelo sculpted a dome out of mathematics. Giacomo della Porta finished it with stubborn grace. Maderno extended the nave, because Baroque Rome preferred dramatics with more runway. Bernini wrapped the square with colonnades that hug. The obelisk outside Egyptian granite Orphan was hauled to the square in 1586 by Domenico Fontana, an engineering ballet with ropes, pulleys, and the famous aqua that saved both stone and reputation. Obelisks had careers in Rome. Pagan gnomons, Christian trophies, civic exclamation points. This one became a spindle for processions and shadows, a line maker in a city addicted to straightening its spectacles. All this choreography of stone needed a calendar that behaved. The Julian system, generous with leap years, had drifted. Spring slipped, feasts sulked into the wrong seasons. In 1582, under Pope Gregory XIII, mathematicians, notably Christopher Clavius, Jesuit, trimmed 10 days and tuned the leap year rule. Centuries not divisible by 400 would skip the leap. Civilizations do not sleep easily when their calendars change in a single night. The new system satisfied the heavens and irritated human bones. Bells rang when told. People suspected they were wrong anyway. And somewhere, a scribe wrote double ring about a night that felt like 2. That is the embroidery around our thread. The thread itself, after 5 chapters of measurements and jokes, is almost immodestly small. The 13th hour understreet. Peter's dome is an optical geometric echo, a second weaker path of light, sometimes moon-born, sometimes lantern-born, sometimes both slipped through an architectural slit, amplified by a specular patch, a shiny surface, and delayed by extra path length, so that our instruments and, occasionally, patient eyes register a shy encore, roughly a dozen seconds after the first. The basilica has a habit of resonance in sound. 2 RT60, long enough to knit harmonies into scarves, so whispered hymns, acquire a twin. Add a halberd on the right angle, and you get a controlled third bounce to tickle the brass sun in the stairwell. Beautiful. Slightly ridiculous. Repeatable. Why tell all that, with Peter and Nero and obelisks? Because a single beam of light is not a story. A history is a braid. The Scavi bones and brick. The dome, math and mortar. The calendar, astronomy and politics. The Jesuit meridian across town that proves noon with a hole and stubbornness. The obelisk outside that lines up processions and whispers about wind. The craft marks, like XIII, scratched under a rail by hands that expected a future craftsperson to care. The 13th hour is a competent trick. The history that makes you sleepy happy is that Rome keeps its tricks in folders with other people's names on them. Lucia insists we walk those folders one last time, at human speed, like pilgrims who major in footnotes. First, back to the Bianchini Meridian in Santa Maria degli Angeli. We arrive just before true noon. The tiny gnomon high in the wall throws a coin of sunlight onto zodiac inlays. Children lean in as if gravity needed help. The beam crawls, then clicks across the equinox mark, with the kind of decisiveness only photons can afford. We watch people understand, in the space of a moving shadow, that time is local and sky-driven. Lucia, soft voice of a person who knows how to talk while leaving quiet intact, explains the equation of time one more time. The sun's apparent speed wobbles because Earth is both tilted and elliptical in its manners. Clocks average the wobble. Your watch lies and tells the truth simultaneously. The universe finds this hilarious and calls it mean solar time. Then, to Sant'Ignazio for Pazzo's Not a Dome, where anamorphosis choreographs space until honesty snaps in from a brass disc on the floor, Lucia makes you step off the disc and back on, and off again, until you feel what the basilica has been doing at night. Aligning matter and sight so that right place equals right picture. The trick in both churches is not to be fooled. It is to learn where to stand. Back across the river, we pay our respects below. The Scavi has the atmosphere of a library, where all the books are people. There is the graffiti wall with names and pleas. There, the cubicula doors with paint that refuse to leave. Here, the precise disarray that tells archaeologists they are looking at stratigraphy, not storage. Our guide gestures with minimalism born of reverence. We do not chase bones. We acknowledge veneration, the oldest human technology for leaving importance where we cannot leave proof. Petros, Eni, the scratch says, Peter is here. People wrote that when maps were philosophies. You cannot fit that into a regression. You can, however, carry it upstairs like a quiet weight. Up again, to the drum chambers inside the dome, to the ladder and the slit and the brass meridian-like disc on the landing, to the shelf where Lucia's lux meter naps like a cat on a windowsill. We lay out our photos. Slit scan rails, one brighter, one fainter. The polarizer tests, where the second rail obliges by shrinking and swelling. The overlay of ray tracing outputs and reality. The acoustic spectrograms, where EDT and RT60 do their long, patient job. The notebook pages littered with RH%, temp, azimuth, altitude. The sheet with Fresnel curves and a doodle of a halberd edge that now belongs in optics class. It looks absurdly official for something that tucks people into sleep. Matteo arrives with a grin and a formal bow. Choirboys are masters of comedy at low volume. He hums a scrap of Angelus forward and one backward, then announces with professorial gloom that convolution has ruined his appetite for demons. We applaud as if he had banished them anyway. Sergeant, Ricci examines the memo, BRDF. What your blade already knows. Nods gravely and announces, I am prepared to brief my colleagues that the halberd is Lambertian on the wrong day and specular on command. Lucia corrects him kindly. It's both, like people. He accepts the amendment, as all decent soldiers do, and asks whether he may keep the memo. He may. It will live in a guardroom next to a thermos and a story. Brother Paolo appears with a small envelope that smells like varnish gossip. The mirror plank we borrowed had a flake. A lab coaxed data out of it with bad light and good conscience. Shellac, with a whisper of copal. He says resin chemistry typical of 19th century conservation. Refractive index to 1.51, 1.54. Shiny territory. No one meant to build a mirror. Someone meant to seal dust. Intent is a majority shareholder in history, but it never owns 100%. A courier from the archive brings the reproduction we requested for a sane person's memoir, the page with double ring, and the later faint 13. Lucia adds the multispectral images to our table like a conjurer producing color from black and white. There is something healing about the way light infrared, ultraviolet coaxes layers to confess gently. The penciled 13 was a later hand, a tease. The original scribe meant sound, not clock face. The rumor met the workshop, and they agreed to share a shelf under folklore. We turn to what every story postpones, what to do with it all. Lucia proposes we keep two versions, because Rome always does. The operator's version for the night staff, clear diagrams, angles, safety, a schedule of likely nights' dry air, certain azimuth windows, standstill seasons bolded but not worshipped, instructions for halberd tilt, no one loses an eye to physics, and a line that says, if the second beam does not appear, it is not a failure, it is a weather report. And the public version for the curious, where we tell it as the basilica likes to be told, slowly, with jokes, and with enough definitions to make sleep fair. There is the question of what to do with XIII, the tiny incision under the gallery rail. Lucia has already filed the conservation request. Do not overclean document with raking light, leave the mark to future hands, because the world is not a museum of completed thoughts. There is the question of publishing for scholars, the regression with standstill terms, our cross-validation, our warning against overfitting our desires. Brother Paolo volunteers to read a draft with the cruelty of love. We thank him and his cannoli. Afternoon leans. Rome rehearses dusk. The square outside gathers footsteps like a low tide gathers shells. Bernini's colonnade folds everyone into the same geometry, regardless of doctrine or shoe. We step out with our folders and our sleepiness, and the giddy fatigue of people who have persuaded a building to do nothing more than what it always did, but now with labels. At the obelisk, Lucia cannot resist one last pettiness on behalf of accuracy. She stands on a pavement, wind rose marked Tramontana, and announces, for the record, this is North Wind, not a lifestyle. If you post it to social media as mood, the obelisk will not object, but I will. She smiles. As she says it, jokes are the sugar that lets precision go down. Dusk sets Levante softly. The obelisk's shadow lengthens and misses everything it could impress. The dome goes through its golden hour routine photogenic, unbothered. Inside, the slit waits. Our instruments are packed. Our data is not. Our story is ready to choose a tense. Past midnight, the second beam will likely appear again, entirely unimpressed by our attention. It will not be braver because we saw it, but it will be easier to share honestly with a guard, a choirboy, a librarian, a traveler who didn't know they wanted to know. And because this is a story for sleep, we end where sleep likes to begin, with what stays. The bones below stay, whether or not the exact label pleases you. The dome stays, talking gravity into cooperation with ribs and coffers and a lantern that behaves like a gentleman. The obelisk stays, pretending to be a clockhand and succeeding often enough to keep its job. The meridian line across town stays, letting noon be noon even when watches insist on other numbers. The calendar stays not as truth, but as a treaty between the sky and our schedules. The rumor stays, because people are the kind of creatures that gift an extra hour to nights that deserve it. And the small marks stay. XIII, the halberd memo, the BRDF joke in a guard room, the umlaut in a cataloger's pencil that turned gelotet into a new vowel in our folder of evidence. What do we call it, if not miracle? You ask, sleep already negotiating a truce with curiosity. Craft, measured, Lucia says. And mostly, she offers the softest farewell the basilica allows. Thank you for walking slowly with us. If the hour finds you again, let it. If it doesn't, the story still fits. Subscribe so the next gentle riddle will know where to send its invitation. And Sleep Rome will keep the watch. We turn away. The square breathes. Somewhere in the drum, a thin sheet of light rehearses its second entrance. It will not pay rent. It will show up for work. And under street, Peter's dome, the 13 that isn't a number will take its place like a footnote at the edge of a page, perfectly content to be read by whoever remains awake long enough to smile at it, and then, finally, to drift.